Hi guys, so in this video we're going to look at basic baking techniques. So what we're going to do is we're essentially going to try and bake all the detail from this model onto this model here. Okay, so we're starting off fairly simple here. The process of baking is essentially adding, using a high poly mesh with more detail to bake onto the low poly and transfer that into a normal map. A normal map is a texture map, which means it's then applied as a texture file, and then it will change the way that the light affects the model. Okay, so we'll cover this in class in a little bit more detail, but essentially we're turning a high poly mesh, baking that down to a texture, which is then applied to our low poly mesh over here. So there's a few things to be aware of to begin with. The reason we're going to start with a cube is because if we just go along here, I'm going to open a new window. What am I looking for? Modeling editors, UV editor. Okay, so because it is a texture, it means that it is going to bake it to our UV map. So our model needs to have UVs. So I'm just going to use a cube. Okay, you guys maybe make your cube a little bit more exotic, but if you do, you're going to need to make sure you UV unwrap that, or at least automatic unwrap that. Okay, so the low poly mesh is your mesh. All we're going to be doing is faking it a little bit here, so it's not going to make it any more 3D or anything. So the detail that we add should be surface detail. So what I've made on this file here is loads of kind of little rivets around the side. I've probably gone a little bit too far with them, and we'll have a look at what the settings give us when we bake in Substance Painter there. Okay, so there's a few things we need to do to start with. So obviously we need to make sure things are unwrapped properly. So once they are unwrapped, what I'm going to do is I am going to rename my files. So Substance Painter will bake meshes by mesh name, which means if you have multiple meshes for your model, then it will bake each one individually. Okay, if you in the past you'd usually have to bake each part one by one and then merge them all together. But it'll bake it kind of by their names. So it stops basically, I don't know, the handle getting baked onto something where the handle shouldn't be baked onto. So I'm going to call this cube. I'm going to put an underscore, and then I'm going to put low, so that our suffix here is low. I'm then going to do the same with my high poly, so it needs to be called exactly the same. So I use a capital C at the start there. I'm going to put an underscore, and then this time I'm going to write high. Okay, I've used a capital H. Awesome. So next thing I need to do is I'm gonna make sure my history is deleted. So delete all by type history there, and I'm gonna reset my scale over here. So I could either go up to modify freeze transformations up there, or the options box. I could freeze the translates. I could just what's the scale I just want to freeze, or I can actually right click here with them selected, freeze and scale those. So they're back down to 1 there. This one again, I am going to freeze the scale on that one. I don't want to freeze the transform because the next thing I need to do is I need to perfectly overlap these. Okay, so really easily I'm just going to hit that back to 0. So now they're perfectly overlapped. What's going to happen is when we bake them together, it's going to fire rays. So if we just have a look here, it is going to fire a ray, which is going to hit the mesh here, and then it's then going to continue, and then it's going to hit the low poly mesh. So it's going to see which ones it's hit, and it's going to be able to work out the kind of the distance there, which will then generate into colors on the texture sheet, so on the normal map that it generates there. Okay, so I've got both of my files named. I've got my low and my high. I've frozen my transforms. I've deleted everything. I've reset them both to 0, 0, 0. I am now going to export them. So I am going to export this here. I exported mine earlier. You can see I've exported it here, and I've called it the same. So cube underscore low. So that way I'm not going to get confused with my files. And I'll export that. I'll then do exactly the same with my high poly mesh. Lost the button there. Okay, so export and then the high. So obviously I've already done these. Okay, but you'll export yours. So now if we hop over to Substance Painter, I've got Substance Painter open here, so this is Substance Painter 18, and I first need to make my new project. So File, New, and I'm going to use PBR Metal Rough as standard, and I'm going to select the mesh that I'm using. So the mesh you are using is your low poly. Remember, we're not adding any new model data, we are just baking that down to the texture. So I'm going to open that there. I'm not adding my high in, I'm just using my low, so my low is my model. I then set up anything else I need in here. 1024, I'm going to leave it at that for now, since it's a fairly small file, and I'm going to press OK. So that's going to bring our cube in here. You can see obviously the UVs are done. We now want to look at baking this down. So I'm going to go over to my texture set settings. Okay, so if we just move these around, make these a little bigger. Okay, so my texture set settings in here, we've got display settings, shader settings at the moment with the default setup, my texture set settings, and then we're going to go to bake. So this is where we're going to bake all of our different maps, so not just normal maps, we'll have a look at the others as well. So down the left hand side, once we've clicked bake textures, you can see we're going to bake normal, world space normal, ID, ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and thickness. Okay, so ambient occlusion you might be aware of. This is sort of self-shadowing. This works out quite nicely with normal maps as well. Adds a little bit of soft shadows in the corner of things. Everything else is things that Substance Painter uses. So thickness, position, curvature is where Substance Painter is gathering information about your mesh that it might use for smart materials and things. Okay, at the top we've got normal map here. We've got some fairly standard settings here, so we've got our texture size depending on what we're using. I'm going to leave mine on 1024. We could use our low poly mesh as a high poly mesh, which means it would just bake itself onto itself, so we would get no new data, but we would be able to bake things like ambient occlusion in there. And then this is where we plug in our high poly mesh, so this is what we want. So I'm going to click the little paper sheet or whatever that is there, and then I'm going to select my high poly FBX here. So click that, that's brought that in there. We can use a cage file. I'll talk a little bit about these in lessons. They tend to not used as often anymore. And we're going to scroll down a little bit further. And we're going to go to match. So this is really important here. So we're going to match, it says always, we're going to change that to by mesh name, and that's where we change the name in Maya. We've got anti-aliasing here, which is going to anti-aliasing some of the texturing. Obviously this is going to increase your file size and increase the time it takes to bake. I'm just going to leave it as none for now. I want to run a test bake first, and then I'm going to put the suffixes in here. So I use capital letters. We need to make sure that we set it to the exact same thing. Again, if you're not sure, just hop back over to Maya, have a look at what you called it, copy and paste whatever works for you, but it needs to be exactly the same, otherwise it's not gonna pick that up there. Okay, so we hop back up to Substance Painter. So I've got that set up there. That's all done. I'm now going to go at the bottom and I'm going to bake those textures. So it's going to take a little bit of time. You can see it kind of working here. Okay, there we go. So it's now baked the textures and we can see it in real time over here. Now it looks kind of flat. It doesn't look quite like the spheres that I had on mine. You can see where I've got no anti-aliasing. If I get close, it would soften off those sort of jagged edges there. That's what the anti-aliasing would do. But it looks kind of flat. So let's hop back into that bake. We've already got our mesh in, so it remembers our settings from before. But this time we're going to have a look at these options here. So max frontal distance and max rear distance. This is sort of how far the rays are going to look. So I'm just going to increase that a little bit. Now, so I put those to 0.7, and let's bake those now, and let's have a look at the differences, which you should be able to see in real time. There we go. So you see those kind of sort of popped out a little bit more. So basically, it wasn't searching far enough in the previous settings. So now we're getting a more of a 3D look, and at a distance, you can't really tell that these don't exist. Obviously, if I flatten that off, we can't see any of those top ones there, which we would be able to on the normal one. But remember, this is just faking it. This is a way to optimize your meshes. Okay, now let's just have a little look at the channel itself. So I'm going to go into my shader settings here, and I'm looking for single material. Okay, I think I can hit B. Okay, there we go. So if I hit B on my keyboard, there we go, this is what I wanted. View mode normal. So what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at the normal map. It's showing me the normal map over here. So this is really common for a normal map, this sort of purple and blue look. You can see that there. So the colors actually refer to kind of sort of the red, blue, and the green that you'll have from your X, Y, and your Z, and that's sort of affecting how when the light comes in, what angle it reflects off of on there. So that's our normal map there. If we then change that to material, that's going to set that back to the material mode, and you can see our bake settings. So it is as easy as that. It gets a little bit more complex when you work with higher poly meshes, but you just need to remember this is surface detail you are adding. It is not complete magic. It's not going to add any new geometry for you. It's just going to kind of bake those things down, so it's perfect for things like scales on a lizard, pores on skin, little kind of crevices, little rivets, things that might have maybe quite a lot of geometry in that you don't want to have in your actual polygon file, because it's going to slow down the game. Okay, if we had 50 different versions of these and they all had all of those kind of rivets in them, it's going to be infinitely more polys. Okay, so this here is obviously our 6 polys of our cube. Yeah, it looks a lot more detailed than that. Okay, awesome stuff. Thanks, guys.